Teaching poetry can be extremely challenging. I mean, how on earth are you even supposed to teach students how to understand these completely abstract poems and concepts? But it can be really fun if you have a different lens and a different approach through which to teach poetry, especially analyzing poems. So what we're going to talk about today is using poetry stations, 5 of them to be exact, to teach students how to annotate a poem, how to read a poem, how to look at a poem, how to understand what the heck this poem is even about. So I'm going to walk you through each one of these poetry stations, from talking about what we call the unnoticed, if you guys can see that. You know, what types of things do students notice about the poem, right? Things like take a look at the title, answer some questions about the poem based on just the title. So I'm going to walk you through each one of these different 5 poetry stations and show you how I would teach students how to annotate a poem based on these poetry stations. And what this would look like for you in the classroom would be using these stations as a guide for students. So what I would do is I would go through each of these stations with my students with a sample poem on like an Elmo and project it on the board and show them as I walk through a poem, my thinking, the questions that I'm asking, what's coming up for me, all of that stuff. And then I would give them whatever poem it is that I would want them to actually study, something different than the sample poem, and send them in partners or groups around the room to each of these 5 different stations. Doesn't matter where they start, they could start on station 4 or station 1, and they work through and read the poem through different lenses that each of these stations has students focus on. So let's go ahead and dive into station number 1. I'm going to show you how I would annotate a poem in station number 1, and then we'll continue so on and so forth through 2, 3, 4, and 5. So you can really start to see this unfold for what this would look like for you in your classroom. All right, let's dive in.
All right, diving into station number 1. Station number 1 is all about the unknown. You know, what do students not know about this poem? Words, phrases, entire sentences, etc. So the first thing that students will do is they will circle or underline or highlight words that they're unfamiliar with, and then they'll use a dictionary or a thesaurus to find the definition or a synonym of these words and actually write that information directly on the poem. And they're going to do this for every single word that they don't know. Once they finish that, check it off. The next thing that they'll do is they'll think about the poet's diction or their word choice. Like, why would the poet choose to use one specific word and not another? And here, this could be, you know, the author has a purpose. What is that? And students are going to indicate that directly on the poem by simply writing next to the words that they've underlined, highlighted, etc. And again, check it off once they've completed it. The next part is students will use their knowledge of figurative language to really understand the deeper meanings of the poem. So they're looking for similes, metaphors, personification, and they're going to highlight, underline, etc., and write in the margins, you know, what does this mean? What is this simile alluding to? What's this a metaphor for? Why are we using personification here? And write those notes inside the margins of the poem. And again, this is where you can also model this for your students for the first time through. If they're like, there's not a chance they're going to be able to do this on their own. And that's also why they're in stations. Students can work with a partner, they can have support, and again, why you're modeling it for them. And once they finish that, they'll check that one off too. All right, so station number 2 is all about the retelling. So in order to understand a poem in depth, sometimes the best thing to do is to rewrite what they do understand using their own words. So in this particular station, students are going to spend time working through the poem line by line, rewriting each line or stanza. So they're going to read the poem first without doing anything to it. They're just going to read it. Then they'll read through the poem line by line and stanza by stanza, retelling it as best they can in their own words. And when students retell the poem, they don't necessarily need to rewrite every single line, but they should rewrite every stanza at least, or summarize every stanza at least. However, there certainly will be times that you will need to rewrite in order for it to make sense. So students might need to take a certain sentence and really put that in their own words in order for it to be clear what it is that the author or the speaker or the poet is actually trying to portray there. So here students are writing it directly on the poem. And if they get stuck, they can skip it, come back, not a big deal. Just trying to see what students can garner from the poem on their own. All right, station number 3 is called the questioning. And this is where students get to kind of push the envelope a little bit and play devil's advocate. They're going to question the poet's purpose, and that allows them to study the poem through a different lens. So students might find that they'll discover something fascinating that they wouldn't have normally considered had they not questioned the poet. So we're going to give them a checklist to help them question the poet in an effective and academic way. So seeing how far we can push the poem. Is this poem really just about what it seems to be about, right? Or is the poet making a larger social commentary here? Or what might have influenced the poet to write this poem? So students are thinking about these questions, they're looking through the poem, working through the poem, and they're going to write them at the bottom of the poem or wherever they can fit it, and then answer each of these questions using evidence from the poem to support their thinking. Then station number 4 is the theme. So here students are creating a thematic statement, usually, a significant topic to the poem. And this really helps them identify, what the larger purpose of the poem is about. What's the larger social commentary that the poet might be trying to point out? What's the deeper meaning and things like that? Once students create their thematic statement, they will then choose a line from the poem that truly exemplifies the theme. They're going to highlight it or put brackets around it and then answer the questions, what deeper meaning does this line hold? What is the larger social commentary that this line might be trying to point out? And this is where students can really get deeper with the poem. What does this mean? Is it really just about the road not taken? Is it really about a road in the forest? No, of course not, right? And then station number 5 is the last one, and this is all about the unnoticed. So here students are focusing on 3 important aspects of the poem that can sometimes go unnoticed. And those are things like the title, the speaker, and the tone. And so we've provided students with questions to guide them as they walk through each of these 3 aspects and answer them on the poem. So the first thing students are going to do is take a look at the title of the poem, and they're going to answer questions. Does the title provide you with any clues about the poem? How does the title relate to the poem, its theme, and its message? Does the title make you think about the poem or view it in a different way? And then students are going to look at the speaker. Who is the person telling this poem? Does the poem shed only light on who the speaker might be, right? Or does it give any other information as to who this person is? Does the speaker even matter, right? And also, does the speaker seem interested in what they're sharing in the poem, or do they seem indifferent? And how might that play into their understanding of the poem, right, in the overall message of the poem? And then finally, we get to the tone. And tone is the writer's attitude toward the subject of the poem or the audience for the poem. And so tone can also be general emotion of the poem. So they're going to pick one specific adjective that encompasses the overall tone of the poem, and then they will write one sentence that incorporates that adjective and explains why it represents the overall tone of the poem. And as you look at the end of this poem, at the end of this annotation, at the end of these stations, look at how much depth students have gone into in understanding this poem.
So now that you've seen poetry stations in action, you can really understand how this works so well for students in one, understanding and just reading poems, but getting deeper into the poems, going further with their analysis, really starting to think outside, right, of that box in which they live in, outside of their world, different perspectives. It's such a beautiful way to read, to discuss, to understand and appreciate poetry. So hopefully you loved this video. If you did, definitely subscribe to our channel for more like this.